Welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the hottest legal weekly topics in the U.S. I'm Virginia Tarani.
And I'm Chelsea Rogers.
And we are part of Tarani Law, LLC, because you never need a lawyer.
So you do.
Okay, big day here. It is our first guest, as you can see on our camera. Welcome to Dr. John Weil.
Good to be here.
Dr. Weil is with us. He is one of the preeminent First Amendment scholars in the United States. We are thrilled to have him on here. He's coming to us from MTSU, Middle Tennessee State University, where he is the Dean of the Honors College. And
go ahead.
No, I'm so excited to be here, for you to be here. So we've moved things around a little bit, but I want to tell everyone why you're here. In addition to being a preeminent First Amendment scholar, is we have started the Supreme Court arguments. They are on our doorstep. They have started this week. It is currently February 24th, happy hour. But what we've been doing is seeing the start of the season. Yeah. And what a start we have. Dad,
well, actually,
I know that
the court's been in session since October. But
sure.
Often they will, more typically you'll get the results of the most important cases toward the end of the term, which is usually second part of June. I made the mistake one year of leaving town at the last week in June, and I missed numerous opportunities that you can't let slip by.
You can't get those back.
That's right.
Before we get into anything, I don't think you introduced him. You just let it slip. You said, "Hey, Dad," without telling everybody.
I did. It just kind of went in there. You're right. So not only is Dr. Weil a wonderful scholar, writer, professor, and dean, but he is also my father. So I am very honored that he is on here as such a leading scholar and as my dad.
I think I was the only one you could afford, wasn't I?
Don't tell everybody.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
Fair enough.
How great it is that I get the best at the greatest rate.
Exactly.
What a tagline there.
And I guess I guess your counter is, I'm not talking to the New York Times right now either, am I? So
that's true. But it's fun because you have done a lot of consulting or interviews, at least locally.
I have.
And which stations? Is it radio and TV?
Yeah, mostly. The ones I enjoy the most there's the Channel 5 Plus in Nashville, and they have a call-in show. And anybody can call in, and they do. And the secret is always to be, however zany it sounds, to be respectful. Try to remember who it was and try to at least garner something from the conversation that could be of wider value. It's a lot of fun.
Nice. And I know that you've written a lot of books. So we want to talk about some of your books because it's definitely applicable to today. And then because it's the weekly wine, we'll talk about the wine. But for your books, yes. Okay, so let's talk about the wine first. We did Dad's Water.
Yes, it
brought
is.
To you by Pepsi bottles.
Yes. And I equally like Coke and Pepsi, but I can only do like 1 or 1.5 a day, and I've already exceeded my quota. So back to work.
So he's drinking wine or we're drinking wine for happy hour. Maybe your water will turn
water
into
to wine. That's what I was.
Well, maybe so. Okay, if it does,
keep us posted.
You may have a bigger program than you were expecting, right?
Right.
You may have other people volunteering to talk with you.
Loads. That's hilarious. So our wine that was not first water is a Linganore. We have the Linganore Winecellars. We've done a Linganore or two already. One a white wine a couple weeks ago, which was just delicious. But this one is the Retriever Red. So you can see that it's locally grown. I don't know if you can see the label here. We'll try to put it in the comments or a picture or two, but it has the Maryland flag on it.
Is it really?
Yeah, it does. You can see it.
It's a very unusual flag, by the way.
I was going to say, maybe I'm dumb. But is this what the Maryland flag looks like?
Is it at least the same color and patterns?
Does it have the coat of arms of Lord Baltimore? In
appears
half of
to.
it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, no,
I've
it's,
never-
I think we might be able to
was
move it
gonna
closer
say,
to the camera.
it's one of the busiest flags in the nation.
I honestly don't
but-
think I've ever seen this before in my life.
Yeah, no. I wrote an encyclopedia on the American flag. So in the
What?
process of doing that, I learned a lot about state flags as well.
That's fun.
And that's a lot of, you've done a lot of writing.
Well, and in Maryland, see, you have, well, you used to have this, the Francis Scott Key House,
Hmm.
which got destroyed. You now have a bridge in its place. And I believe you now have a reconstructed house of the woman whose name escapes me right now, who actually did the flag that flew over Fort McHenry. And
Oh,
she was
wow.
aided, by the way, by a slave girl
Okay.
they've gotten recent information about her, and they have a museum connected with that house. Actually, I wish I could remember her name, because, Betsy Ross always gets all the glory for the American flag.
flag.
It turns out she was a flag maker, but not likely that, in fact, almost certainly did not sew the first American flag, whereas we know the person who sewed this humongous flag that flew over Fort McHenry and that inspired Francis Scott Key.
Wow.
Amazing. And that is okay, so one of the books that you've done, that's the one with, oh goodness, give the title, because it's been over 30 books
I
that
have
you've
no
done?
idea what it is, what the title is. I mean, like an Encyclopedia of the American flag or something.
Life goal, write so many books you don't remember them.
Well,
That's
or
amazing.
get old enough that you don't remember.
I don't think that's
We
it at all.
haven't even written one, so it's okay. But one of the ones that you've written, we are going to put a link to Dr. Vile's biography page on the MTSU site that gives his CV with all of his publications, his accolades, which are quite a few, so that you can see and have access to those. But the most important one for today and the Supreme Court cases that we're talking about is the Encyclopedia of the First Amendment. And I have a copy. It's a two-part one. I'm going to show you the one. It's a beautiful cover. But the Encyclopedia of the First Amendment, and it does have the three editors. You're one of three,
right? And that book has sort of evolved. MTSU has a mass media and entertainment college, very en courant. They have all the latest technology, but for a time, the dean there was Ken Paulson, who is a lawyer. And one of the founding editors of USA Today. And so he is no longer dean, but he has an office here in the Honors College and continues to write. And he got the rights of this 2-volume encyclopedia and put it online under. So if you simply plugged in First Amendment Encyclopedia, you would go to a site at mtsu.edu, and you can literally plug in any of these cases we talk about and many more, or topics or individuals, anybody that's had anything to do with free speech, and get an essay on them. And often multiple, cross-referenced essays, each with references to bibliography and the like.
That's great that it's free. So we will include a link to that as well, that anybody can have access to it.
The last time I checked, I think we get about 20,000 hits a week, or I don't know if it's a day or a week, but we get a lot of hits on it. And, it's educational, certainly fulfills the mission of the university as well as the Mass Media and Entertainment College.
And we even used it today. Now we use the hard copy, but in order for us to prepare, or at least be semi-prepared compared to you, Chelsea was able to look up one of the preeminent cases that we're dealing with that builds onto the current ones.
Okay.
So we're going to cheers ourselves with the wine, and Dad with your water.
Yep.
I like
happy hour.
Mine's still water.
No change yet.
No, not yet.
Okay. We'll check in every once in a while.
Okay.
Because if it could change to this wine, it would be delightful. It's very,
Okay.
It's like light and refreshing.
yes, it is light. It is smooth and light, not heavy.
Retriever red. I like that.
So we'll put a
You
little
know, I
bit
have
of
a
that.
theory about wine.
Oh, what's your
which is
theory?
that it's similar to colors. There are colors that women refer to that I don't believe exist. They refer to them simply to show that they're better educated and more refined than we are. And usually when somebody tells me about, the body of a wine, or, this tastes like magnesium, over vanilla, I just don't tend to believe them, but all the best.
Look, I brought my favorite wine a couple weeks ago, and it was a $10 bottle, and it was delicious.
It was really good.
Well,
I think we
price
ended up
doesn't
finishing
always,
that one off air.
always reflect. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it might have been the color fuchsia.
There is no such color.
Chartreuse.
The colors of MTSU are true blue. And we thought maybe to spice things up, what if we changed it to true taupe or taupe?
Oh, how funny.
That's
True
so funny.
Use a color that, no other school would choose. And just see how
you were the only one with blue taupe. Yes.
Yes, we would be the only ones. Yeah. True taupe. Yeah.
True taupe. I like it. We'll start a trend. And so that everyone knows, I am a very proud grad of MTSU.
And of my alma mater.
Yes, and of William and Mary.
Yes.
So Dr. Vile, my dad went to, and my mom, actually, they both went to William and Mary, the College of William and Mary, where they met. So that's
so cute.
Yeah.
It is really sweet. And
I married up.
together.
That's why I went to William and Mary.
So sweet.
It's been almost 50 years. Is it what, 47 this year?
My graduation date is 50 years this April. Yes.
What's
Incredible.
the secret?
To graduating or marrying?
Both.
Marriage.
Yes,
both.
dear. Yes, dear.
I love it.
So they went to William and Mary. I went to the law school, the William and Mary College of Law School. And then I graduated from MTSU with Dad as my coach, my mentor, my teacher, my
mock mediation.
Yep. Did all of it. And we actually did a little video that I'm going to put so people can see the interview that Dad and I did about Dad. So we're going to put that
It had more to do with my ties than it did about me. I was a little concerned about that. Today's, by the way, is the Supreme Court.
I love it.
We had multiple stages of the interview, and what I've done is I've broken them up into pieces. So the first piece is about you, your background, your expertise, your CV, and then I've got James Madison as another one, and your ties as another clip. So we've clipped them into pieces that we will continue as we continue our consultation with you over the next few weeks and months for the Supreme Court year. We'll continue to put the videos out, but yeah, so just a sneak peek, Dad has hundreds of ties.
So cool.
Hundreds. And each time he wears one, he tries to pick something that's related to the day, the topic, the meeting, the church service. And today, because we're talking about Supreme Court cases, he has worn one about the Supreme Court.
And last week it was, well, most of this week has been presidents, since it's President's Day, Monday.
Very fitting. Did you have a particular president?
I actually got one with all the presidents on it through, I don't know if it had the last two.
Oh, wow.
But pretty much, yes.
That's pretty impressive. Yes, his tie collection. It's like antiques.
I feel like
and
that
so
is
we
such
had
fun.
We had scholarship winners in on Monday. And each one of them, I asked them a question about presidents before I would talk to them. No
Some
pressure.
Trivia there.
If you go to MTSU, beware. Skip the honors college. I don't know. At least the luncheon. Okay, excellent. So we've got the background, and we're going to do two 3 cases total, but split them into 2. I think the most interesting, hottest ones this week are the one that's not quite Supreme Court placement of
It's
the
just
Fox
similar to what.
News. Yeah, it's very similar. It's a First Amendment issue that we're dealing with.
It is.
That is very hot right now. And then we're going to parlay what we talk about with the First Amendment for the Fox News case into the YouTube, Google, Twitter cases, the companion cases that are being heard by the Supreme Court that deal with whether social media platforms can be held liable for content they recommend, not content they create, but content they recommend through their algorithms and get put out. These cases, everyone is on pins and needles. I look at a lot of YouTube. We started to publish on YouTube, and one of the people that I follow who just does YouTube, he, the new thing coming out, what to check out, his Friday podcast was all, I'm not talking about anything else but these cases. He has no legal background. He doesn't know the law at all, but his entire podcast was about these cases. He was reading off portions of the cases, portions of the argument, and saying, this is what would change if these cases succeed and how everything will be different. And he was doing different hypotheses about what would happen, but it's going through the media world.
Yes. I mean, as a generation that grew up with the internet and social media, truly, I don't think I had my first social media account till I was in high school. Watching sort of the exponential growth is terrifying. And when you have people who are newer to the internet, hearing these cases and trying to define and explain an algorithm, and then a legal argument on top of it, just convolutes a lot of the issues.
Well, and a lot would, if we're going to do those cases now.
We're talking about them. Let's do that one and then go into the Fox News ones, because these are the ones in the Supreme Court.
Well, my own judge, let's begin with the fundamental distinction, which is, typically when we think of the great cases before the Supreme Court, we think of cases, particularly if you're a political scientist, as I am, you think of cases involving constitutional interpretation. And probably many of your listeners have probably heard of judicial review. So judicial review is a process not actually listed in the Constitution, but consistent with it, whereby courts, federal courts particularly, can examine laws and decide whether or not they're constitutional or not. And if they decide they're not constitutional, then they become unenforceable. But many times, and probably as many as you have of judicial review, you also have cases involving statutory interpretation, which is, what does the law, as written typically by Congress, occasionally by states, but what does congressional law say about a subject? And in this case, 1996, the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, which I think has 26 words, basically says—
It's very short.
Yeah,
it is. Basically says we're not going to hold a provider responsible for content. Well, at least in normal situations, you would not. Now, if you had a service that tried to collect every provocative, inflammatory advocacy of violence or revolution that you could, then you might be liable for the same reason the original. But in a sense, it makes the internet fairly similar to a telephone, right?
We were talking about that today. Is we were even thinking of, well, what about Verizon and the telephone providers of just talking on the phone?
Right.
I mean, if I doubt that hopefully, well, maybe not. I never hope criminals are wise, but presuming they'd be, most of them would probably be wise enough not to use something that could be tapped or possibly later retrieved. But if somebody, if I were to call someone and order a hit on another person, you wouldn't expect the phone company to be liable for that unless they had some special service, call a hitman, here's how you do it. But if, typically that's not the conversation you expect to be carried out over a telephone.
And it's third parties. The telephone is the way that third parties communicate, but it is not the actual communication.
Makes me think of those
Right.
like party chat lines in the early 90s.
Oh,
You know what I'm
yes.
talking about? Where you could, where you could just call in. I heard about it. I was a little too young to participate, but it sounds so interesting. You could just call and sort of be connected to other
so
people who
much
call
better
in.
for senior citizens back then, because particularly after my grandfather died, my grandmother routinely would pick up the phone and she would know what was happening with her neighbors. And from time to time, a neighbor would chime in if you'd say, well, I can't remember the date of that. And it'd say, oh, that's coming up on such and such. They weren't even in the
I
law.
love that.
So yes.
Oh, that's so funny.
Those were the days.
So, but this case, so we have two. We have, and they're both related to this section 230.
Yes.
And we have Gonzalez versus Google that was heard on Tuesday by the court. And then, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but Twitter versus Tamna is the best that I can do for Wednesday. And the first one, so Gonzalez has to do with the Paris terror attack. And when I first started reviewing the case, I was like, why are we dealing with something in Paris? How in the world can we have a liability case with a Paris terrorist attack?
Yep.
And then we get to Twitter and I look at the same thing as this one's about the Istanbul shooting in 2017. And the question still remained in my head is why are we dealing with overseas terror attacks when we're in America? And I think the biggest issue that we're seeing is, well, it's about an American in each of these cases that was killed during those terror attacks.
Right.
And whether the services, these social media services, and Google owns YouTube. So I believe it was YouTube that their algorithm apparently was putting out recommended sites for the Taliban or ISIS.
Well, I mean, basically what happened, you have algorithms for all kinds of things. And in fact, Justice Thomas, said, well, there's probably an algorithm, if somebody looks up rice pilaf, you're going to find other rice dishes or, other dishes of that similar nationality or whatever. And so the argument, which I think is rather tenuous, is that people in ISIS were not mobilized, radicalized by the fact that every time they went to one site advocating violence, they were directed to another. The algorithm, as I understand, and here's where they could get in trouble. If you, and we sort of mentioned this earlier, if you had an algorithm that was specifically designed to, feed people only propaganda that would be related to overthrowing the government. There was a similar issue recent, one of the employees of one of these companies has said that the algorithms, and I don't know how purposeful this was, but that they led young women particularly to bulimia, because you would have something on how to lose weight, and then they would send you, and I guess body dysphoria, whatever it's called, but dysmorphia, if a teenage girl, others too, but if a teenage girl saw nothing but pictures of Twiggy, and this is I'm dating myself, but anyway, pictures of Twiggy or someone
I picked up on it.
okay, so someone very thin as the ideal, then and of course part of this, the answer on something like that is you would hope that most teenage girls would have parents who would at least be a little sensitive to how much time their children are spending on social media. So Virginia, you want to tell the story of your sad childhood? Because
we didn't have social media.
Yeah, well, you did. You had
like an AOL chat.
There was some kind of game that you wanted that I did not want you to waste your time on.
I mean, Nintendo. There was the Super Nintendo coming out in high school.
No, it wasn't Nintendo. It was something else that in your senior year, you finally got enough gifts for Christmas that you could buy it on your own, and I didn't feel that I could stop you from buying it. but it was
It was
basically
the Super Nintendo.
Oh, was it?
It
Okay.
was.
I mean,
that's so
basically, it
funny.
wasn't anything vicious. It was just I didn't want you. I wanted you reading books.
Right.
Bible.
This would
No,
encourage
the Bible. Good stuff.
that Yoshi and Mario would encourage me to want more Yoshi and Mario because I
Yes.
was spending my time on it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I
But-
think it's interesting. I think with the young girls and the employee coming forward, if I remember correctly, it was a Facebook and Instagram, so it's
I
owned by
believe that
Facebook
may be right.
employee. But it's hard because the way any of these algorithms are going to work, each company wants you to stay on their site for as long as possible. So if you're looking at a video and that's what you typed into a search engine, they're going to show more of that content. And like the way our brain works, more extreme versions of that content, if it's weight loss, if it's ISIS videos, whatever it is, because that's going to keep you there longer. If they keep showing
Well,
sort of the same
and
level.
increasingly, as a society, one of the beauties of when I was growing up is there were 3 networks, and you had 3 basic sources of. I mean, I'm sure there were others, but everybody saw ABC, NBC, or CBS, and they were all sort of middle of the road. They didn't divide them into you watch, and now, if you're very conservative, you watch Fox News. If you're very liberal, I don't know, maybe MSNBC, although I watch that from time to time. In any event, we tend to watch stations that reaffirm our pre-existing view of politics in the world, and particularly partisan politics.
Exactly. Our own beliefs. We look for people who are
We're in
like-minded.
silence, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the human condition. It's the confirmation bias, is you seek out things that are going to support your worldview, your perception of things.
Yes.
But now, where you used to have a couple stations that were middle of the road, people understand that, and they're intentionally putting out polarizing and extreme content because it gets them views and they can monetize it, right? Like that is the
Exactly.
influencer generation.
Yeah, people, not even the algorithms. People are putting out more exciting, inflammatory things.
And this, so when we get to the other case we're going to talk about, this will bleed into that. But
I think that it's the escalation that a lot of people get sort of caught up on, but it's how human psychology works. It's like your basic hits of dopamine, right? I only know this because I'm ADHD, but that's the thing, is like it's the reward pleasure center in your in your brain is seeking dopamine, seeking that uplift, and the only way to get it is like, it's like adrenaline junkies. Okay, like you went skydiving once and it like hit that level, but the more you do it, you're not going to get that next hit. It's almost like addicts too. And so these algorithms have learned that you have to like increase whatever the original content is, bad, good, or otherwise.
Dad, does it seem in the arguments that we're hearing and what seem to be what are the underlying briefs? The arguments don't seem to suggest that people are just getting hits about ISIS or terrorism unless they initially start. Does that seem to be the idea?
I think so. Again, the bigger, there are 2 or 3 major issues. One is, essentially right now, this law holds harmless the providers, much like it would hold harmless a phone company or a telegraph company or something that wasn't, again, they're not trying to get people to do hits on people. It's just they don't monitor every conversation that takes place. But so one issue would become the primary difficulty with the cases, as I understand it, is, what goes into radicalizing someone to become a member of ISIS? Well, it might have something to do with the internet, but it might just as easily be a peer. Mm-hmm. It might be, I hate to think somebody would get a thrill from seeing people get blown up, but maybe they do. Mm-hmm. And, but this is really exciting. The link to what were they mobilized by something they saw on Google? And if they were, was it largely their own, I think my reaction to an ISIS video might initially be a little curiosity, and I suspect it would then be revulsion. I can't imagine wanting to see somebody's head chopped off or, whatever happened. And if someone continues along the line of searching for those kind of videos, whose fault is it? The company's fault? It's like, holding someone responsible for reading a book, reading Dostoevsky and saying, well, that was sort of cool. Somebody kill somebody, try to get away with it. I'm smarter than he is. Maybe I'll try it.
Right.
In debate, this is what we used to call a lack of causal links. Legally, I guess, causality,
Right.
showing that somebody watched a violent video or even a series of violent videos and then went out and committed murder does not prove that that's what caused them to commit that murder.
Well, and that's what gets to me as a personal injury attorney. It seems much more basic than even Section 230. It doesn't feel to me like we're dealing with a First Amendment issue. It doesn't feel like we're dealing with a third-party provider issue. It feels like we're dealing with causation. What caused the terror attacks? And okay, maybe these videos that they saw based on algorithms contributed to what they were doing, what they were watching, where they were headed, but was that the ultimate cause of this person's interest in terrorism, the interest in ISIS, the furthering
and widen it out? I mean, I looked up Twinkies and they sent me to, puffs, and then they sent me to chocolate bars, and now I'm obese. Am I going to be able to sue the providers for that? Don't I have any responsibility? And how many people? Yeah, and I mean, I don't know how many there are, but how many people have probably seen an ISIS video? Did they go out and start shooting somebody? And now, having said that, I have deep sympathy for anyone who is the product of one of these violent attacks. I can understand how you would want to sue you want to make the world right. And Virginia, this probably wasn't the best training for an attorney, but how many times when you were growing up did I say life isn't fair?
No, it's true.
So, okay, so this is my question for both of you as the least experienced person sitting here. So as we're talking about this, almost the example that you gave of it being similar to like a negligent sort of thing. I mean, then do you look at the internet as this inherently dangerous thing, which then they have a duty to have some sort of these precautions? And going back to sort of, well, they didn't type in, I'm not sure if they didn't type in an ISIS video and they typed in something sort of benign, how many videos down the algorithm does it take? Because I would be much more inclined to see a problem if it takes 2 videos to go from, something moderate to extremely dangerous versus if it's 40 videos down the line. And what does that look like? Pose that to everybody.
Again, if they did an algorithm for the purpose of promoting violence, then, that is not a legitimate First Amendment use of speech. But, where would liability stop if everybody who read a violent, well, remember, it wasn't that long ago that there were, and I had some sympathy for this case, that there was a case out of California where they were trying to sue the makers of violent videos. I think violent videos are disgusting, particularly if they're marketing for kids.
Right.
But how many kids have seen a violent video? I mean, you can't watch TV without regular TV without seeing 3 or 4 deaths, or fake deaths within every half an hour or hour. And we know lots of people who watch crime shows who don't go out, hopefully, and commit murder. So the causation.
I'm probably the biggest horror fan. I love those, but
crime junkie and horror fan right here.
I really am, but I can't imagine going out and doing something like that. It kind of reminds me of the video game defense we saw. I think it was kind of late 90s, early 2000s. And it didn't go well in court, though. They tried to assert that these video games were the cause of these boys usually doing something violent. And it just didn't, I didn't buy it. The juries didn't buy it. The judge didn't buy it.
This goes all the way back to Aristotle. Catharsis, do you know about that theory?
I don't recall it.
Well, so in Greek plays. Now, Greek plays, usually the violence took place off stage. But, does it cause violent action or in the process of seeing violence, and particularly if it's followed up with justice or some kind of vengeance or something being made right, does it just give you the feeling of relief? I have that out of my system now. I don't need to kill somebody. I've seen somebody killed on stage
That's why I like my revenge movies.
Yeah.
So how does this, with the First Amendment, is there a larger implication
Sure,
for the freedom of speech with
Sure.
these cases?
Sure. I mean, do you want to stop every book that might incite some, are we going to outlaw Karl Marx because there was a communist revolution? I just assume nobody study Mein Kampf. But if I'm a scholar and I want to learn about Hitler, I probably need to read that to understand the origin of the ideology. Absent, some very select areas like obscenity or libel, we'll talk about with this other case, we have tried to keep a wide expanse for freedom of speech and press. And the argument has always been that, one of the arguments is, the marketplace of ideas, that, the solution for bad speech is not to outlaw it, but to have good speech or accurate speech. And we're ultimately responsible for the decisions that we make on the basis of whatever we've read or we've seen. And one of the things that became clear in oral arguments, particularly in Tuesday's case, was the court's concern that how wide would this door be open? Would the courts be just, and again, we have apparently an obesity crisis in our country.
Right.
We have a gun crisis. And you can think of any number of crises that ultimately somebody could blame on, well, if it weren't for that blame media, this wouldn't be happening. And how many juries are going to have to weigh, what was the true cause? And I'm sure, from the standpoint of the murderer or the terrorist, don't blame me, don't tax me, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree, blame the media for it.
Has the Supreme Court blamed the media for anything specific in the past, or is this somewhat of a really new issue?
Well, I think one of the fascinating things about the court, to which I had great sympathy, was most of them were saying, we're probably the 9 people in the United States who are least acquainted with this kind of technology. It's same thing happens when you're a dean. You study political science and get a PhD, and the next thing you know, you're picking out wall colors for the hallway. And I think a lot of the justices sort of felt that way. Why are we chosen? But I think there is a genuine fear that, we're going to have hundreds, if not thousands of cases. And many of these, again, most of them are going to rely on the facts. And frankly, even if they open the door, my guess is you'd have a hard time persuading me that somebody went out and killed somebody in a terrorist attack because they watched too much YouTube. Now, maybe it would fry their brain. I might buy that argument, but there are other more useful things they could probably do. But the causation would be just so tricky there. And even if the court, I think what the court should do. I tend to favor judicial restraint. There's a law there now that seems to cover it. If Congress thinks that law is not adequate, then let Congress hold hearings, come to something, come to a law that's maybe better, and then leave it to the Supreme Court to decide, does this new law trench on the First Amendment or not?
One of the justices was seeming to suggest that very idea.
Yeah, I think there's, why. I don't know how you would argue that the existing logarithm is unconstitutional. But if you adopt a new law that is too restrict, I think the danger of a law would be sorting out, we're we have a law that favors violence against, Muslims, but not Christians, or, Jews, but not Gentiles, or whatever, then it would be time for the court to say, no, the law you have here, the current law clearly does not, as far as I can tell, do anything to violate the First Amendment.
Now, with that law, let's hop over to the Fox News case, because we're still talking about the First Amendment.
Absolutely.
But in this particular case, it feels like we're flipping, where instead of holding someone not liable or, cutting them off, it seems that there's a clear violation in the second case.
Well, I'm going to leave it to the judge and jury, I suppose, to decide whether there's a clear violation. But what you have is you have people who have you have a news broadcast,
which is Fox News,
in this case, which highlighted during a very volatile time, including, the attack on the Capitol, they were highlighting allegations from Sidney Powell, Rudolph Giuliani, perhaps the president himself, others, that the election was fraudulent. Now,
and this was the news
right,
broadcast publishing these types of information.
And what Fox News is trying to argue, so let's go back to there's a classic Supreme Court decision, New York Times versus Sullivan. And I should have the date for that. I want to say 1964. Does that sound right? In any event, I may be confusing it with New York Times versus U.S. But in any event, in New York Times versus Sullivan, a group of civil rights leaders publishes a full-page advertisement in the New York Times, basically alleging that they have been treated unlawfully, unfairly. And it turns out that there are some factual inaccuracies in the article. Most of them, for example, at one point they said the police had surrounded the campus with force, and another, if I recall, they claimed
padlock. That they had padlocked the door. That was another one.
Yeah,
they had
padlocked
them
and there was another one, like, they said they had sung the national anthem and they had sung My Country 'Tis of Thee, or some such. And Sullivan, who was a police chief, who was the center of the allegation here, sued on the basis that this was libelous. And I think your viewers will know it, but slander is orally defaming a person, giving a speech, in which I, call somebody a communist who's not a communist, or accuse you of a crime that you're not. Lies. That's right. That's slander. And the written form of that is libel. And First Amendment gives wide berth to expressions of opinion. Basically, in the U.S., you cannot legally be responsible for stating an opinion. Now, stating things as facts is a little trickier. And in this case, there were some mistaken facts in the article or in the advertisement. But
in the New York Times one.
The New York Times advertisement. The Supreme Court said in cases, and this gets a little trickier as it goes along, but basically when it involves public figures, in this case, a police chief, in most cases, a politician, or a public figure, the only way to prove libel is to prove what's known as actual malice. You have to show that this advertisement or this article was published with knowledge that it was false, or with reckless disregard for the truth. Now, what we now know is what's unusual. So many cases against sort of entities like Fox News or public individuals, they make an allegation. In most cases, it's sort of dismissed. It was just not enough, people understood that was a statement of opinion, not a statement of fact. We don't have any real reason to believe that, everybody makes mistakes. And particularly the higher you are up, the greater chance you have to respond.
Right.
If you call the president a communist, the president can get back on the next day and say, I'm not no communist, here are my credentials. Here's what I've done.
Right.
I did this, had a son who died, that sort of thing. But what the court said is to prove something is libelous when it involves entities like this, you have to prove either that it was made knowing that it was false or with reckless disregard for the truth. Well, in the discovery process
of this new case, of the Fox
of
News
the Fox News case, in the discovery process, they have actually uncovered, as I understand it, emails in which Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingalls.
I can't remember how to pronounce the last name.
A number of the participants there are apparently writing back and forth saying, Sidney Powell, this is completely unbelievable. Why are we doing it? And then one of them says, we got to keep this up or our stock prices are going to go down. And they said
we'll lose views.
They said the same thing, Sidney Powell and Giuliani. I'm not sure if the degree to which the president is involved, but basically what they are saying is Dominion voting machines are falsely recording. When you push a button for Biden, they're counting that button for Trump. And Mike Lindell, my pillow man, he was in on this as well. We have plenty of evidence here. As I recall correctly, I believe Giuliani may have I'm not sure if it was under oath or not, but he was appearing before state legislatures saying we have lots of evidence that Dominion voting machines are inaccurate. And
which is why Dominion is suing, because they're saying our voting machines
now
have been said that they don't work. So how will they get money? How will they get business if everybody thinks they don't work?
Substantial amounts, like $1.5 billion. Now, I think if there's a weakness in their case, and this is not one I'm, that familiar with, but the question is, did these allegations in fact result? Obviously, they resulted in some harm to reputation. But I'm not positive that a harm to reputation to a corporation would be quite as bad as it would if you were making allegations about an individual person. But
under the law, the corporation is seen as an individual.
That's right. But in any event, I think the sticky wicket in that case is going to be how much actual damage was done. Not, partly it might be reputation, but did Dominion sales, did they decrease as a result of people being fearful that they were somehow subject to manipulation? And I just don't, that would be, that's one of those juries, particularly, you have questions of law and you have questions of fact. And generally, we regard juries as the ultimate determinant, with few exceptions, of fact. And so, I think if I were Fox, I might be saying, well, maybe we didn't quite, I wouldn't admit to anything probably, but, even if you think we didn't exercise due caution, when it comes to damages, we're still, they're still in existence. How much harm did it really do? I think it would be less to do with, but, when you're on record as saying, now, Fox's defense is, we didn't say it was true. We said, these are the allegations that and they were very publicly making. I mean, is the ultimate liability, and here's where the lawyers come in, right? Is the liability with Fox News, or is it with Giuliani, Sidney Powell, maybe Donald Trump, anyone who has made allegations? And then again, if you go to this New York Times test, they'd have to know it was false, or I think more likely, it's just reckless disregard for the truth. We want to
Exactly,
win.
the reckless disregard.
Yes. I mean, that's what you have, I think, at issue in this case.
Well, that's what happened with Elon Musk, which
Yeah.
just happened just a few weeks ago. The
Yeah.
jury came back, and it was a question of a Twitter, a Twitter post, a tweet that Elon Musk had done about his public trade, whether he was going to actually publicly trade his company or,
Right.
And the question for the jury, the judge even decided it was a false statement.
That was wild.
That what he put out was false, that he did not actually have funding
Right.
to privatize, or however it was.
I don't even remember the exact
tweet. We actually did the case. We've talked about it multiple times, but it's escaping me. But the judge decided, and the jury was told that the judge had already decided that the statement was false and that it was reckless disregard of the truth. And then a couple of weeks later, all of a sudden, we have this, what to us seemed like a shocking decision, that the jury is saying, okay, even though it was reckless disregard of the truth, we're not going to hold him liable for this. And he was completely exonerated in the civil world for his tweets. And his testimony was, well, nobody believes him. That was what he says, is I put a tweet out and nobody believes what I said. The stock market doesn't, respond to my tweets. It responds to everything else going in the world.
Right.
So I think that's going to be the same type of defense that Fox News has to present, is just because we said it.
I know he's not a politician.
They're the news.
Yeah. I know he's not a politician, and I don't believe this, but the old adage is, how can you tell if a politician is lying?
Their mouth is moving.
Or their lips moving. And so there is, I do think there's a degree to which we expect hyperbole in politics. And that's basically what the New York Times decision was designed to protect. But there is a difference between hyperbole and outright lying and emphasizing stories that that you yourself believe to be cockamamie, and you're putting up there in a program that's supposed to be not only commentary, but also news. But again, in many ways, I think Giuliani, Powell, maybe Trump himself are probably as responsible as Fox News is, maybe even more so. That's where the law degree maybe would have helped. In knowing which one to go, and of course, part of what's happening.
All of them. The idea of the plaintiff is whoever has affected you, and if they made a statement about you, and you believe that it led to that any of these statements were libelous and they led to damages, then you sue all of them and let the courts decide which ones had the most culpability. You sue them because you believe they had some. You can't just sue anybody and everybody. There has to be a good faith basis to believe that they contributed. But you don't pick and choose. You say any or all of these had libelous statements, slanderous statements, so they're all going to be sued. Let the judge or the jury decide which one had a percentage. What's their percentage?
And I think that brings us back to where we
after.
started. This came out in Discovery. Yeah. So this is why they included everybody to see who knew what and when, which I think is kind of the core of the issue.
And typically you do prefer to go after people with deep pockets, right?
If you can, if you have damages, you want money to repair those damages.
I'm guessing a corporation like Fox News is probably going to have deeper pockets than even Mike Lindell, no matter how many pillows he sells.
He sells. We may sue the pillows. I don't know.
If you wrote this in a novel, nobody would believe it. That you have a major, and if I remember correctly, at the end, even President Trump decided he was no longer going to meet with Mr. Pillow, even though he was, and to this day, I think is still saying that the election was rigged.
Mm-hmm. And many people still do believe it. And that the interesting thing from this podcast will be people comment on the podcast, and we're trying to respond as we can and as appropriate to the comments. But I'm guessing many of our viewers may also say, well, they weren't false statements. It is very likely that some of our viewers will get on and say, well, they can't be found libelous because they weren't libelous statements. They were true. It can't be libel if they were true. And that's another question for the jury is, were the statements true?
What I would encourage such viewers, and, I know people who believe the same thing. What we do have a system that comes as close to Lady Justice as you can get, and it's called the system of courts. And there have been 70 to 80 different cases in which the results of the election have been brought before neutral arbiters. And in each case, there may have been one or two exceptions in a lower court, but ultimately each of these concluded that there was not widespread fraud in a way that would have affected the outcome. And the other control, of course, and I mentioned this program that I sometimes do locally, where people will call in. The journalist that I was talking with said there's not a journalist in the country who would not have run with a story that we had elected, the election was really reversed and Trump should be our president. If they could have found that evidence, you'd get a prize, right? Pulitzer or something for being able to show that. So we have checks within the system,
right?
Fortunately, because again, our man, surely he won, right? Everybody I know voted for the same person I did. So how could he not have won? I get that, why people think that. But it turns out that we do live in our little silos, and our friends are not necessarily the state or the world as a whole. And fortunately, we have independent journalists, which are protected by the First Amendment. We have a court system where people are appointed. They're not chosen by popular acclaim. They're not kept in office by popular acclaim. And thank God for it. They are checks on the system, just what the framers wanted.
Thank God for freedom of speech, right?
Right. We want it to be a freedom.
And press.
We want to keep it.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us and for hitting these topics. We are looking forward to seeing you again on our podcast. I know we have many more Supreme Court cases and arguments coming up.
We will, especially toward the end of June.
So don't go anywhere. We will all be staying tuned. So Chelsea will be studying for the bar during that time.
Unfortunately.
So we're going to see if she can join us for those programs, but at the very least, you and I can do some consulting and collaborating, and hope that she can join us on some Fridays.
Sounds good. And, in the meantime, I don't get paid anymore for this, but that if you have an issue particularly related to First Amendment Encyclopedia, just go on site. And just about any case name or justice, or, one of the things we didn't discuss was, the different orientations of justices. What was interesting, particularly in the Google case, was they didn't seem to be lining up in the traditional fashion. Both right and left seemed to be very concerned about, are we just going to be opening the floodgates to suits? Is this going to, implicate First Amendment issues? So, anyway, it's a great source for people to go to.
Thank you for the reminder, and thank you again for joining us with your water for happy hour on Friday. Cheers again. We would love the comments. Again, we're happy for you all to comment. This is a commentary show. It is not legal advice to anyone. It is opinion based on our freedom of speech, of the opinions that we have about the current cases and where they might head and what's happening with them. We are thrilled to give them to you. And we look forward to seeing you again next week for happy hour. Stay tuned. Check out the Law Unscripted, which is what's hosting these podcasts. This is the Legal Weekly Wine. And I am Virginia Tarani.
And I'm Chelsea Rogers.
We are with Tarani Law, LLC, because you never need a lawyer.
Who you do.
And thank you, Dr. Vile, for joining us today.
You're welcome.